for the most part, the United States policy of containment is going to be a success in Europe. The Soviets are not going to expand their influence beyond where they had it in 1945. No new countries will fall to communism, and no additional countries are going to be taken over by the Soviet Union or brought under Soviet influence. It's basically the same places you had in 1945. The Soviets are going to be selling their goods there, getting resources from there, and the same place the Western countries controlled in 1945 is where they're going to control all the way up until 1990. So Europe is a success as far as containment's concerned. The same can't be said of Asia. What we're going to see in Asia and in other parts of the world is that these Western powers will have some success, but there's also going to be some failures. So while Europe, you keep the Soviet Union where it was, in places like Asia, Africa, and to an extent Latin America, we'll see the Soviets expand their influence and gain new markets. So when you talk about containment in Europe, thumbs up for the United States, but if you talk about it in other areas, mixed results. So let's focus first on what happens in Asia. So the United States had defeated Japan in World War II, and as a condition of surrender, Japan authorized the United States to station troops in Japan, oversee disarmament, things like that. So U.S. troops start landing in Japan in 1945, disarming the Japanese military, and we're going to see from 1945 until 1950, the U.S. is going to have forces throughout Japan. They'll eventually remove their forces to a couple small bases in Japan, but in the 1940s, U.S. soldiers are occupying Japan. So the United States is going to have to determine the future of Japan. Well, when the Cold War starts, the United States realizes, man, Japan was incredibly economically successful before the war. It would sure be great if Japan achieved this success after the war. Now, throw away the imperialism, but if we helped rebuild Japan and we made it into a pro-Western, pro-United States, capitalist country, it could serve as an example of this is what capitalism can bring you rest of Asia. So if you show Japan going from this country that had been destroyed in the early 1940s into a country that is economically successful, then other Asian countries that may be threatened by communism, look what Japan's doing. You can achieve this too if you adopt capitalism. And again, the idea is that the less countries that adopt communism fall into the Soviet influence, more markets the United States is going to have. So what the U.S. will do following World War II is they're going to decide to just heavily invest in Japan. They'll start pumping money into Japan's economy, just like they've done with Europe with the Marshall Plan. They'll start rebuilding Japanese railroads that have been destroyed in the war. They'll actually at one point start rearming Japanese soldiers as a police force. Now Japan, per the treaty, is still not going to be able to, even to this day, not be able to build certain weapons. But we want to make this country at least somewhat powerful militarily, and then we want to make them definitely economically powerful to serve as our ally in Asia. Again, we got the Soviet Union extending all the way over into Siberia, just right off the coast of Japan. And as we're going to talk about, other countries are going to be considering communism. Let's show them what capitalism can do. So the United States will start pumping money heavily in Japan. They're also going to make sure that Japan stays their ally by allowing the Japanese emperor to continue to hold office. So this is the same guy that authorized Pearl Harbor. Some people in the United States are calling for him to be tried on war crimes, but they realize this would turn a significant portion of the Japanese population against them. So instead, they're basically going to say, you can remain emperor as long as you stay pro-West, pro the United States, you can maintain your position. So the Japanese emperor will start supporting U.S. efforts, and the U.S. is going to remake Japan's economy. And Japan's economy is going to grow substantially. This is something that happens if you're not taking money and you're throwing it in the military. The United States is basically serving as your military. You can invest it in infrastructure, and then with the aid of the United States, helping to rebuild infrastructure, schools, that type of thing, Japan is going to start producing rebuilding rapidly, and start becoming this incredibly successful capitalist country to the point where, and we'll talk about this shortly, they start competing with the United States in some markets overseas. But that's to the point where the United States is going to have to say, whoa, we wanted you to become capitalist, but not this good later on. We'll see the Japanese start competing with the United States in things like automobile industry. So in this regard, Japan is going to be a success. It's going to serve as this example of what capitalism can do for you in Asia. So containment, you would say, as far as Japan, thumbs up as far as the United States is going to be concerned. Well, what about the Philippines? The Philippines, again, had been taken over by Japan during World War II. The United States had liberated the Philippines in 1945, and the Philippines had been destroyed during this war. Again, Japanese invasion, followed by the American invasion. We'll see a lot of Filipinos are going to be have their livelihood having been destroyed, and their country's going to be torn apart, which is opens it up to being taken over by communist influence. Again, if people have nothing, communism offers at least the support of the state, which will give you something. So what do we do here? Well, communism as the United States, one of its sort of rallying cries is that is against this imperialism. So the U.S. had been keeping the Philippines as a colony. They lost it when Japan had taken over. Now are they going to continue to keep the Philippines as a colony? Well, the thought is that if they do, you could have these communists calling on Filipinos to rise up against the United States because they're taking their goods and resources, sending them back to the U.S. So what do we do about this? Well, some people in the U.S. argue that we need to increase the military presence in the Philippines, make sure they stay within the United States, and crush any communist insurgency with military might. Basically, almost do what the U.S. did during the Philippine-American War. Well, the counter-argument is going to come with some people who would suggest, why not just let the Philippines go? Basically, a lot of Filipinos had assisted the United States in defeating Japan. What if we do that and we support the Philippine government in rebuilding, and we make allies by offering independence instead of denying independence? The U.S. will end up adopting this policy in 1946. Now, they're going to put some measures in place when giving the Philippines their independence that will keep the Philippines economically dependent on the U.S., but for the most part, the Philippines are going to be able to elect their own president, and they're going to be able to control their own economy. Again, there are going to be some economic provisions. These will eventually go away, by the way, keeping them attached to the United States. But the answer is going to be, we prevent communism by removing one of the appeals of communism, which is decolonization, getting rid of, making Philippines no longer a colony. So U.S. allows Philippines independence, and this is going to be successful. This communist potential for return to communism will never emerge in the Philippines, and even independent, they're going to remain a close ally of the United States during this Cold War. So again, containment successful as far as the Philippines. So Japan and the Philippines are a success story for the U.S.'s containment policy. What about China? Okay, so World War II, as we discussed, had also torn China to pieces. Japan had invaded China, had taken over some of the wealthiest parts of China, and killed millions, tens of millions of people within China, and basically had almost taken China for Japan. Well, a lot of destruction. At the end of the war, Japan was actually still in China. It's only going to withdraw when it surrenders to the United States. What do we do about this country? Well, very end of the war also, by the way, Soviets had invaded China to remove the Japanese. But what about China? Well, prior to World War II, there had been a civil war in China between pro-communist forces who basically said China has been essentially a colony of the West, and this goes back even back to the Boxer Rebellion. Even there'd been this open door policy. Some people thought there'd been too much international influence in China, and you had these communists basically saying we need to rebuild China on our own, get rid of foreign influence, And then there was this pro-Western nationalist party who wanted to maintain China as a capitalist nation, maintain its ties to these Western nations. And these guys had been fighting one another. When Japan invaded, somewhat these guys had set aside their differences, although there was a little bit of fighting between them to fight the Japanese. But the second the Japanese are defeated, we're going to see these communist forces and capitalist slash nationalist forces go at it once again. So think about it, 1930s, communist fighting capitalists in China for the future of China, pause to fight with Japan, and then game on once Japan's defeated. Now the pro-communist forces in China are going to come to be led by this guy. This guy's name is Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong will be the leader of the faction that wants to make China a communist government. The communists, or I'm sorry, the nationalists, the capitalists, the pro-Western faction in China will be led by this guy. This guy's name is Chiang Kai-shek. So following World War II, Mao Zedong will rally his communist forces and start engaging the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek for the future of China. Initially, it looks like the communists are going to lose. There's some patches throughout China that support Mao Zedong, but Chiang Kai-shek is controlling the military, and again, he's got he's the one that had been in power, so it's gonna look like this is not going to be a long-lasting civil war. The communists are going to eventually be defeated. Well, in spite of this, Mao Zedong will hold on 1946 into 1947, and Chiang Kai-shek's going to have a difficulty completely crushing this communist forces. The U.S. is going to look at this by 46 and 47. It's clear that we got this Cold War going on in Europe where you're trying to contain communism and stop the spread of Soviet influence. So the U.S. is going to look at China and they're going to say, hey, looks like Chiang Kai-shek has got this thing under wraps, but potentially these communists could keep growing and this place might go communist. Probably the pro-Western capitalist forces are going to win, but there's a small chance the communists are going to win. So what should the U.S. do here? Well, some people are going to say, don't worry about it. Chiang Kai-shek will have this thing wrapped up. He's going to defeat the communists. And the U.S., China will remain an economic partner of the West. It won't go communist. And then, it'll continue to be an outlet for our goods and it'll continue to be a source for our resources. It won't fall into the Soviet sphere. But again, there's this fear of growing communist influence. And so some people are going to say, shouldn't we make sure that Chiang Kai-shek wins? And some people will argue that Truman should give direct military support to Chiang Kai-shek. Send in U.S. soldiers, support him in rooting out the communists and defeating them. Hey, we have a number of soldiers right here in Japan. Let's just redeploy them now that we're occupying Japan. Let's send them over to China and help them defeat the communists. Well, Truman, you've just gone through all these years of war against Japan and Germany, doesn't want to do that. So he's going to listen to these third advisors that say, well, we don't want to directly get involved here, but we do want to make sure that Chiang Kai-shek wipes out Mao Zedong's forces. So let's go ahead and send him military advisors, weapons, arms, anything that will help him wipe out the communists. And they make this decision the same time they're making the decision to support Greece in their civil war between communists and capitalists. And there it had worked. So Greece, you send pro-capitalist forces, weapons advisors, they win, and Greece stays in the pro-Western sphere. So let's just do the same thing for China. So the U.S. takes this approach, and they start sending these goods. And you can just imagine like goods showing up in Chiang Kai-shek's army with American flag on it and saying, yay, China, America loves you, something like that. I mean, obviously not exactly like that, but Chiang Kai-shek starts receiving direct aid from the United States. So you would think this would push Chiang Kai-shek over the edge and help him defeat the communists like had happened in Greece. Instead, this has the opposite effect. And to understand this, think back to the Boxer Rebellion and think back to what the Chinese have been going through the 1800s and what we saw with the Boxer Rebellion, and even you can even compare this to what had been happening when Japan invaded China. What China had been seeing for decades was their labor and their resources going to a foreign country. So now that you see the United States and Britain will also provide aid to Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong can point to this and say, this guy is in the pocket of Westerners. He's going to win this thing, defeat us, and then sell us out to those guys, and we'll see foreign influence come in, and we'll be back again, almost colonized like we were in when the outbreak of the Boxer Rebellion happened. So Mao Zedong will use this as a rallying cry, international intervention in support of Chiang Kai-shek as a rallying cry to get people to volunteer for the his communist forces. So almost defeated, we start seeing more and more people join with Mao Zedong, and in 47 and 48, and then into 49, Mao Zedong's forces will start winning a number of defeat against Chiang Kai-shek's forces, and start pushing them back as the years go by, to the point by 49, you're going to get Chiang Kai-shek is on the losing end, and then at the end of 49, beginning of 1950, Chiang Kai-shek, the pro-Western capitalist that almost had the communists defeated in 46 and 47, is going to be at the losing end, and he's going to have to retreat from the Chinese mainland to Taiwan and form his nationalist government here. Now, when he escapes to Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek will claim to be the true government of China, even though Mao Zedong's communists now control mainland China. He's going to say, I'm the head of it. Now, obviously, Mao Zedong will say, I'm the true government of China because I'm controlling China, and my military's here, and there's going to be this dispute over who's the true head of China. Well, if you are Britain, France, the United States, and you've got this guy on Taiwan who's friendly to you, saying he's the head of the government, you want him to be the head of the government. Well, if you are Soviet Union and you have a communist guy saying he's the head of the government, you obviously want this guy to be recognized as the head of China. And this is going to be especially important because think about this Security Council in this new United Nations that was formed in Yalta at the end of World War II. It said there's 5 Security Council members: United States, Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China. Okay, well, who's the head of China now? Who should be sitting in the Security Council seat? Mao Zedong thinks it should be his forces. Chiang Kai-shek thinks it should be his forces. Well, what there's going to be is a decision in 1950 over who to occupy the seat, and you're going to have a vote between the 4 remaining powers. Well, obviously, United States, Britain, and France, Western capitalist countries, are going to vote for Chiang Kai-shek to have his government fill the seat. Soviets, outvoted, they're going to be upset, and they're going to decide to, in protest, abandon their seat temporarily. We're not going to take the seat. You guys, and we all know what's happened here. We all know that Mao Zedong's the true owner of China, or true ruler of China, and Chiang Kai-shek has now been forced to escape to Taiwan, so they abandon their seats. But even though you have Chiang Kai-shek controlling the Security Council seat, basically everybody recognizes that communists have now taken over China. So this is a complete loss for containment. So while you're able to contain it in Europe, you've just lost the biggest nation in Asia to communist influence. Now, as we're going to talk about, the Soviets and the Chinese, even though they're both communists, they're not always going to agree, and sometimes the Chinese communists will side with the United States over the Soviet Union. But for the most part, they're going to be economic allies, at least when compared to between each other, more than they would be with Western nations. So you now have spread of communism and partially, at least, Soviet influence. So this is a major defeat for the containment policy in Asia. And we're going to see Truman's going to receive a lot of criticism for this. A lot of people are going to say, you know, you let us down. You allowed the Chinese or the communists to take over China, and as we'll talk about later, this is going to be this rallying cry against the Democrats. All right, so containment, a failure in that regard. What about this country, Korea? So Korea, prior to World War II, had been occupied by Japan. You have these ethnically, linguistically related people in this Korean peninsula, bordered by China up here, Japan's right over here. Well, in the early 1900s, Japan had sent its armies to occupy Korea and had essentially colonized Korea, redirecting the labor and resources of the Koreans back to Japan. And it stayed under occupation until the end of World War II, when Japan is going to surrender. Well, Japan's surrendering. They're now, as part of this surrender, they have to pull their troops out of Korea, this country that had been occupied for decades. What happens to it now? Well, the question had come up in Europe, dealing with what do we do with these nations that had been taken over by Nazi Germany during the war, and the idea was the occupying nation is going to be the one to oversee their government. Well, at Yalta, they didn't even really talk about Korea. Like, when somebody brought up to Stalin, what do we do about Korea? And basically said, less we talk about Korea, the better. It just wasn't on his plate. But this is going to come up when Japan surrenders, and it's going to come up, what do we do about it? Well, the various powers at the end of World War II will ultimately decide, let's do the same thing. Let's whoever's occupying Korea will oversee the installation of a new government, de-Japanify Korea, so whoever occupies it will do this. Well, at the end of World War II, Japan surrenders. Soviets had invaded China. They're going to hear this. They, again, understand the stakes of what this means for the future. And you're going to see the Soviets will push into Korea because they want to be the one to occupy Korea because they want to oversee the installation of its new government. And you'll have U.S. forces do the same with South Korea. So again, occupying government oversees the installation of new government. Soviets will occupy the top half of Korea. The United States will occupy the southern half of Korea. Now, they're going to end up meeting in the middle, right around this 38th meridian. And again, it's going to be almost this friendly thing. This is Korea. This is an American GI meeting this famous Soviet sniper woman in their meeting in Central Korea. And they're shaking hands and things. They don't know when they first meet in the middle what's this Cold War is going to come in. But it is going to end up being a Cold War because just like what we have in Europe, both sides, when they set up their government, are going to make sure that a government that is friendly to them and their economic system is going to be the one to take hold. So Soviets are occupying the northern part of Korea. They're going to hold elections up here. And when they hold elections, they're going to make sure a pro-Soviet communist government takes over North Korea. And this government is going to be named the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the United States, just like Britain had done in Greece, the U.S. had done in Italy, and places that the Germans had occupied in Western Europe, they're going to make sure a pro-Western capitalist government takes over in South Korea. So up here, pro-Soviet communist government's taken over. Down here, a pro-Western capitalist government will take over. And things are going to remain this way from 45 until 1950. Now, by this point, both powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, had removed most of their soldiers from there, and it looks like Korea might exist as two separate countries going forward. So before the Japanese occupation, Korea had essentially been one country, but now that this line's drawn here at the 38th parallel, now it looks like it's two countries with very different economic systems and very different international alliances. Well, again, most of these foreign troops are removed, and so we have North Korean government up here, South Korean government up here. Well, 1950, these countries are left on their own. The head of North Korea, and I always get these names confused, Kim Il-sung, is going to decide that he wants to unify Korea under a single government. He wants to bring it under a single government, this pro-Soviet, pro-communist government. And he wants to do this. He's going to say he's going to do it with his own troops, and he wants to invade the southern half of Korea. So he actually speaks to China, Mao Zedong's forces, Mao Zedong and his advisors, and he's actually going to speak to, at this time, Joseph Stalin's in charge of the USSR, and he's going to say, I don't need you guys' help. I just basically want to use North Korean forces to invade South Korea. They're not going to make this public, but they're basically going to give his thumbs up, their thumb up, to do this. And so, with this permission, and with foreign countries, except for a handful of U.S. soldiers having been removed from South Korea, the North Korea Kim Il Sung's forces will march across South Korea, and they're going to catch South Korea by surprise. Essentially, they move across, and very quickly they're going to almost entirely unite the Korea under a single pro-communist government. By September 1950, they've taken all but this small, tiny portion of South Korea. Well, how should the United States, Britain, these pro-Western countries react to this? Again, if Korea unites under a pro-communist, pro-Soviet government, this is yet another defeat to containment. You just lost China. It looks like you're about to lose Korea. Well, there's going to be a meeting in the United Nations over what to do. So the Security Council will meet, and because the Soviets had abandoned their seat in protest, or at least temporarily abandoned their seat in protest, they're not going to be there to participate in the vote. So the Security Council will be Chiang Kai-shek's China, the United States, Britain, and France, and they're going to agree to call on the UN to have a military intervention to support the South Korean government. And what the UN will say is that, they'll call for volunteer nations to send supplies to South Korea and push North Korea back to the 38th parallel where it had existed before. So what we'll see is Security Council votes, UN, we're going to send these in, we're going to support South Korea, we're going to push North Korea back to the 38th parallel, and get back to the way things were before this invasion occurred. UN votes, again, they'll approve it because the Soviets are abstaining, and we'll start seeing the U.S. sending forces from Japan, other places. Britain's going to show up, France is going to show up, and a number of other UN nations will send military equipment and men to support this, mainly the U.S. though, and they're going to start pushing back. Some people, by the way, will call on use of nuclear weapons. Truman's going to say, no, this should be a simple military action. We'll push them back to the 38th parallel. So this would be U.S. forces coming from Japan to support the South Korean government. Well, they come in, they're going to do this dual invasion. Some forces will land here, some are going to land in southern part of Korea, and then they'll start quickly, very quickly pushing North Korea back. As a matter of fact, they're going to start pushing North Korea back that within a couple weeks, or a little bit more than a couple weeks, North Korea will already be back by the 38th to the 38th parallel. Very quick invasion, initial invasion, and then this retaliation with these UN forces will very quickly push North Korea back to the 38th parallel. Well, it's so quick, as a matter of fact, that the Western forces are going to say, hey, we did this so quickly, why don't we just go ahead and unify Korea under the South Korean government? So North Korea had taken this initiative and tried to unify it under a pro-communist, pro-Soviet government. Now that the Western powers are in here, while we're here, I know we just said we're going to push them back to the 38th parallel, but while we're at it, let's just go ahead and unify them under a pro-Western capitalist government. So when they get to the 38th parallel, they're just going to keep going. So October 1950, these U.S. tanks, supported by South Korean forces and British and French, start pushing up. And then it looks like by the end of 1950 that Korea is now going to be, again, under the pro-capitalist South Korean government, and it'll be unified once again, just in a very different way than Kim Il Sung's forces had intended it to be. Well, when by November 1950, almost all of Korea had been taken, who do you think gets nervous about this? So who had just become communist? China. Who knows that the West doesn't like them? China. Now it looks like this pro-Western forces this Western government is going to be right on their border, and China's worried that they're just going to simply keep going into China, which some people in the U.S. government thought they should do. You got this guy, Douglas MacArthur, who's going to say we should just go ahead and start dropping nuclear weapons on China and then just push forward into here because it's been so easy taking North Korea. Some people have been recommending it. I don't think Truman was on board with the idea, at least not in November 1950 was, but they're not even going to get the chance because China gets nervous and it decides to send its forces across the border to support the North Koreans. So China will now invade, and with the North Koreans, they'll start pushing back against the U.S. and UN forces, and you're going to see them fairly quickly push back the UN forces right back to this 38th parallel, almost exactly where the border had existed in June 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. So this is, let me just repeat all this. North Korea, pro-communist North Korea, invades South Korea, almost takes it. UN and U.S. and UN forces then invade South Korea with the intention of pushing back to the 38th parallel, but they take it so easily, they push it almost to the Chinese border. China gets nervous. They start sending their troops in, and when the addition of these Chinese troops, and then China's going to send tons of people because it's got a lot of people, they're going to quickly push back UN forces to the 38th parallel. It's at this point that UN forces are going to set up these defenses, and we'll see the Chinese North Korean advance will slow down. And beginning in 1951 and continuing to 1953, you're going to basically have this stalemate at the North Korean-South Korean border as U.S. and UN forces hold back North Korea and China. 1953, there's finally going to be an agreement. It's never actually a peace agreement. It's just an armistice between North Korea and South Korea, but they'll agree to peace, and they're going to go back essentially the way things were before June 1950. So pro-communist, pro-Chinese, pro-Soviet government in North Korea, and then pro-Western capitalist government in South Korea, and things are going to stay that way until today. Now, is this a policy, or is this a victory for containment policy? You didn't take any additional land from the communists, but you basically prevented them from getting additional land. Is it a victory? I don't know. I guess so. I mean, communism didn't expand anywhere else, so you can kind of see it as a victory for the United States. But Truman's going to get a lot of criticism for this because, again, we should have taken out North Korea, and again, some people are going to blame him for losing China in the first place. If you hadn't lost China in the first place, they wouldn't have helped North Koreans invade. So, kind of a victory for containment. All right, so again, Japan is success, Philippines is success, China complete failure, Korea, sort of fighting to a stalemate. What about and this is the breakdown of Korea today. What about Indochina? Okay, what about this area here? So what had happened prior to World War II is Indochina, and we talked about this. The area that's today Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia had been controlled by the French. The French had colonized Indochina, and they did what colonizing nations did. They took the labor and resources of Indochina for the benefit of their home country. So the French occupied this area, and it was a colony of France. Well, as we talked about, France gets taken over by Germany. Indochina will then get taken over by Japan, and it's going to be a colony of Japan now from 40 to 45 until Japan surrenders in World War II. Well, what happens to Indochina now? Well, a lot of people in Indochina had been spending World War II fighting against Japanese occupation of the country, and so they're thinking when the war's over, France has been gone for 5 years at this point, we've been fighting Japan on our own, we should stay independent. One of the guys that's going to be pushing for independence is this guy named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, very well-read guy. He'd studied a lot of different leaders. He really liked Abraham Lincoln. He read United States Declaration of Independence. And And he was a guy who thought colonialism was wrong. It had robbed Indochina of a lot of its resources, and particularly the area of Indochina that Ho Chi Minh called home, which was this eastern part, Vietnam. So what Ho Chi Minh thought was that Indochina should be independent of France. Leave us, we'll go off on our own. All right. Well, one of the things that's going to push against the French against letting Indochina be independent is that Ho Chi Minh and a lot of people pushing for independence had communist leanings. Ho Chi Minh, he'd received some education in the Soviet Union. He actually traveled the world. And so when he says independence, he's talking about putting some socialist communist reforms into Indochina. And then France also realizes, hey, we like getting this stuff from our colonies, so let's continue to get this. And whatever Ho Chi Minh says, let's not listen to him. So France will basically ignore these pleas, and it's going to reoccupy Indochina following World War II, sends its soldiers back there. Well, at this point, Ho Chi Minh will start organizing the people of Indochina to fight the French. And from 1945, 46, 47, we're going to see that the people of Indochina in this First Indochina War, you'll sometimes hear this called, as they fight for their independence against the French army. And again, Ho Chi Minh, he's going to be bringing up, speeches by George Washington, things like that, that we want our independence, we want self-rule. Eventually, Ho Chi Minh's forces will defeat the French forces at Dien Bien Phu. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And they're going to, and once they do this, the French are going to end up withdrawing here. By the way, before I should point that out, the United States will support French efforts to regain Indochina. Again, with the Cold War going on, if France takes this over, we know it's a Western power controlling this territory and not a Soviet communist power controlling it, which means, again, we can have markets there, and it's not a place that will expand with communism. So they start sending aid to France to support defeating Ho Chi Minh. Well, in spite of the U.S. help, the French will end up being defeated, and the question is going to emerge, well, what happens now? What happens now with Indochina? Well, again, Indochina, it's one of the few unifying things about it, because there's so many different people, ethnicities that live in this area, different languages. One of the things that's been unifying was France. How do we deal with this now that the French are pulling out? Well, what's going to happen is the various powers, including France and the United States, is going to have representatives there. Ho Chi Minh is going to have representatives there. And the future of Indochina will be decided at this Geneva Convention in the early 1950s. What does the future of this thing mean now that France is going to leave? Well, a lot of these Western countries don't want Ho Chi Minh taking over all of Indochina, because that means all of Indochina would fall to communism. So what they're going to decide is that we will have Ho Chi Minh's forces, and Ho Chi Minh will agree to this because I will talk about why he basically has plans for expanding communism besides this, and he's mainly looking for independence from Western powers. It will be decided to install a number of different governments over Indochina. So Laos, one government's going to be placed in Laos, and they're going to set up, after France is leaving, it's going to set up a government here in Laos as it departs, a government here in Cambodia after it departs. North Vietnam will have its own government. This is going to be placed under Ho Chi Minh's forces, and South Vietnam is going to have its own government, and the Western powers are going to be the ones to set up the South Vietnamese government. And the idea is going to be that when this is set up at Geneva, that in 1956, and this is 2, 3, 4 years down the road, there's going to be a vote for these various countries to decide whether they're going to unify under single government or not. Now, don't worry about what happens with Laos and Cambodia, but the main thought is that Vietnam, this area, this one government controlled by Western powers, which they're going to make sure is capitalist pro-Western, and this government set up under Ho Chi Minh, which he's going to make sure is communist pro-Soviet China, they're going to determine in 1956 whether they want to be under Ho Chi Minh's government or whether they want to be under the South Vietnamese government. And France, because it's defeated in this war, but also, hesitant to completely hand this over to communists, is going to agree with this because they, and again, the United States is thinking this as well, that if you have pro-communism, communist government versus capitalist government, that the capitalist government is going to obviously emerge ahead. The South Vietnam will be more economically successful than North Vietnam. And so if the people of North Vietnam see what's happening in South Vietnam, they're obviously going to vote for to be capitalist, be pro-Western, because South Vietnam will end up being more successful. So basically, the Indochina pushes for independence from France. France will eventually leave Indochina, but as it's departing, it's going to set up these 4 different governments. Don't worry about Laos and Cambodia. Vietnam will be divided into 2 separate governments. North Vietnam will be set up under Ho Chi Minh's pro-communist forces, South Vietnam under these pro-Western forces, and Vietnam in 1956 will be, there's going to be a vote to determine whether to unify or not. So would Indochina be considered containment? Not if you're voting in early 1950, because this is an area that wasn't communist before, that now at least has North Vietnam is now communist, and potentially when this vote comes up, South Vietnam could be communist as well. So again, Asia, if you're looking at it from the U.S. perspective in the Cold War, some success, some failures. We're very quickly going to look at the Cold War in other areas of the world. Now, the U.S. isn't going to be involved very much in the Middle East, but there will be some questions that will emerge in the Middle East over what to do. In particular, some of these questions are going to stem from what had happened in the Middle East after World War I. So during World War I, the Ottoman Empire is split up into mandates, essentially colonies that were given to Britain and France. But Britain and France had only been supposed to take over these colonies for a different period of time. So it's we're taking over Iraq until I think it's like 1954 or something like that. We're taking France took over Syria until like 1952 or something like that. And this Palestine, the British had a mandate over it until 1948. So what's supposed to happen with these countries now that they're going to become independent? Britain and France, per their agreement post-World War I, are going to be leaving them to become independent. So they'd essentially been colonies of Britain and France, but per agreement they're now becoming free. Well, what will happen in 1948 as the British are preparing to leave Palestine is that you will see a number of survivors of the Holocaust, a number of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, are going to request of Britain that before they depart, they carve out a part of Palestine and allow them to form a Jewish home country in Israel. Well, you see this request. The British, essentially Britain's facing a lot of economic turmoil at the time, and what they're going to decide is that we'll just let this new UN handle things. They can figure out what to do here. Well, there's going to be a huge debate here because basically the powers in the UN, including the United States, are concerned that if they carve this area out of Palestine to become a Jewish homeland, it will upset these other nations in the Middle East, these Muslim-controlled nations in the Middle East. It will upset them, and this is going to be important because as we're setting into the Cold War, and these nations are very oil-rich. So these nations are very oil-rich, and you don't want to upset them because you need this oil, but we'll upset them if we carve out this Jewish homeland. Well, what are we going to do here? Well, the UN's up for debate, and basically it's going to come down to what does the U.S. think that should happen here? Well, Truman's going to go to his advisors, and they're going to recommend you don't approve this, you don't carve this area up because we need the Middle Eastern's oil because things are starting to heat up in this Cold War, and we need the support of them. Let's not surrender this area. Well, Truman, and this is actually against the advice of his advisors, we don't know exactly why he does this, probably for moral reasons. You saw, such a large population of Jews killed during World War II. He thinks maybe they're deserving of their homeland. Some people think it's because Truman, as a Christian, has this idea that Jesus will return when Jews return to Israel. For that reason, we're not 100% sure why, but he's going to push U.S. in Security Council to support the idea of a dual Palestinian-Israeli state here. So the U.S. will push the UN to do this, and we're going to see this Israel and Palestine set up, and this will get the U.S. an ally in Israel. And we're going to see there is going to be a lot of turmoil. We'll come to talk about that a little bit later on. So this is almost like this is one of the few areas where the U.S. goes against its general Cold War policy. It takes an action that might be hurt its efforts against the Soviet Union. Another thing the U.S. is going to be partially involved in is Iran. So the British had been, the Iranian government in 1953. The Iranians are in, I don't want to go into too much into Iranian history, but there's the same thing that had been happening essentially in Greece and in China happens in Iran, that you have some people pushing for communism, some people pushing for capitalism. Well, the government of Iran in 1953, they essentially want to remain independent of both the Western powers and the Soviet Union, but the government of Iran decides to nationalize the oil industry in 1953. Well, the way that the British and the United States are going to look at that is nationalization means socialism, step towards communism. So in reaction to that, the U.S., mainly the British are going to be the ones dealing mostly in the Middle East, but with U.S. support, will support an overthrow of the Iranian government to get a pro-Western guy, the Shah, in power of Iran. So they make sure that Iranian oil goes to the West instead of goes to the East, and he's going to remain in power until the 1970s. So again, it's somebody showing a hint of socialism. The British and the United States will make sure they're overthrown. And that's going to be the MO for Africa. So Africa, prior to prior to World War II, had been carved up primarily by the British and French. Well, after World War II, what are the British and French going to do with Africa? Essentially, African nations had been independent while World War II is going on. France had been occupied by Germany. Britain had been too busy fighting Germany during the war. And so you've seen all these British colonies, military forces had been withdrawn to fight Germany. France hadn't been able to govern these things because, again, Germany had taken over its government. So you saw these countries operate on their own during World War II. Well, post-World War II, a lot of these countries are going to say, we want our independence from Britain and France. Well, the fear is that if they have their independence, Britain and France aren't going to be able to get stuff from them anymore. They like the fact that their country had been gaining wealth from the labor and resources of these countries, and they like the fact that these countries have been forced to buy British and French goods for so long. So what do we do here? Well, Britain and France, following World War II, essentially the opposite of the United States, their economies had suffered greatly because of the war, and they realized that if we can't afford to keep our military forces in Africa to maintain these colonies anymore. So what do? We're worried about them getting independence because that could open them up to Soviet influence and open up to trade from the Soviet Union, communism, but we don't want them, but we can't afford to keep them as colonies anymore. So what we'll see Britain and France do in Africa is essentially they're going to start offering these African nations their independence. And so you see, starting in the 1940s, but especially 1950s, 1960s, the French and British will agree to allow these countries to have their independence. But as the British and French are leaving, they're going to ensure that these countries are controlled by pro-Western capitalist governments. So, before we get out of here, we're going to make sure that the president of Nigeria or whatever is a far right, sometimes pro-Western leaning guy, and we're going to make sure he's so far right that there's no chance that he would go communism. And a lot of guys that are going to be installed in these newly independent government, as the British and French are leaning, are going to be incredibly brutal in maintaining their power. So we want people to take over when we leave that are going to be most assuredly not communist. So what you'll see in Africa in the 1950s and especially 1960s is these countries get their independence, but it's almost as if the Western powers make sure as they leave they're controlled by guys that won't go communist. In some instances, it's going to work, be incredibly effective. Any communist uprising will be crushed quickly. But in some instances, the Soviets are going to use this to their advantage. They'll go to places like the Congo and they'll start rallying people under. Look at what these colonists did. They robbed you of your labor and your stuff, and now they've installed these brutal leaders. We need to overthrow them, install a communist government. And so you'll see in Africa, a lot of times what's going to happen, it'll be a civil war between capitalist and communist countries. Soviets will support communists, hoping they take over, because again, the Soviets can then sell them their goods, get resources from the area, and then the Western powers will send them their goods, and hopefully the pro-capitalist, pro-Western countries will take over. Africa will get torn to pieces by this proxy wars in this Cold War. So think about these areas becoming battlegrounds. They're now independent, technically independent of Britain and France, but the British and French are going to make sure that they leave with guys that they trust in power that aren't going to go communist, and they're going to try to do their best by sending military aid when they can to make sure those guys stay in power. Now, again, the thing with Africa, you need to remember that this is mainly Britain and France doing this because these have been the colonial powers in that region. But Latin America is going to be different. So as we talked about before, Latin America had gained its independence from Spain in 1821, and it had stayed independent throughout the 1800s. But in around 1900, we saw the U.S. start to get heavy political control of these countries by U.S. companies buying a lot of land in these areas, and then sort of keeping politicians as puppets by buying their campaigns, discrediting their rivals. And then U.S. had launched military intervention to make sure that a lot of these Latin American countries did what the U.S. wanted. So the U.S. didn't plant their flag on these Latin American countries, but in a lot of ways they got what they wanted without colonizing Latin America. So what we'll see is that post World War II, beginning of this Cold War, there's going to be some people in Latin America that don't obviously like the situation as it is, because even though not directly colonized, a lot of Latin American countries are losing their resources and labor to the United States, and the people of these countries are growing increasingly poor. Well, what we're going to have is the United States is going to start taking this approach to Latin America that is basically going to be similar to what the British and French do in Africa. They're now going to have to worry about the Soviets gaining influence here, and the U.S. is going to become so fearful of the Soviets gaining power in the Western Hemisphere that they're going to start taking even more extreme measures to maintain political control of Latin America than they had prior to World War II, prior to this Cold War. So I'm only going to give a couple examples of this, but basically the U.S. are going to do certain things to make sure that anybody that might go in the Soviet sphere it doesn't get the chance to rise to power, or if they get power, they're quickly removed. Again, this is just going to give you a couple examples. You'll see any hint of communism or any hint of pro-Soviet influence will be quickly crushed by the United States during the Cold War. How are they going to do this? Well, one way they'll do this is what they do in Nicaragua, and this is very similar to what the British and French did in Africa. Basically, the United States will support leaders of these Latin American nations that are far right-leaning, that will do what the U.S. wants, that aren't going to go communist. So, for example, Nicaragua, post-World War II, and a little bit before that, is going to come under control of this Somoza family. So the Somozas were incredibly far right-leaning, very capitalist. They're very corrupt. They would take work with Western companies to extract resources of Nicaragua, and then these companies would pay them off, and then a lot of times these guys would go against the best interests of the Nicaraguan people for these business interests, and they would profit off of it. And the Somozas Basically, it's going to be multiple different Somosas. The father's the first to take power, but then when he dies, his son's going to take over. I believe it's his brother that takes over after him. They're going to maintain power through cruelty a lot of times. So the Somosas, what they'll do is they'll have these dissidents who don't like the corruption, don't like this is one of the Somosas, don't like what they're doing. The Somosas will take these guys and they'll political opponents, they'll feed them to tigers. Like these guys kept tiger cages behind their homes. They would feed them to their tigers, and they would have horrible human rights abuses. FDR had actually been in power when the Somosas took over, and he was pretty upset about what they were doing. And the question is going to come to Truman, like, should we let these guys take power here, because they're completely getting rid of democracy, and again, they have no. It doesn't seem like they have any interest in protecting the Nicaraguan people. Well, Truman's going to look at the situation, and subsequent presidents are going to look at this, and they're going to say about the Somosas, all right, they are horrible humans, they violate civil rights of their people, but there's no chance they're going to go communist, no chance they're going to be Soviets, so let them be there and actually support them. And as a matter of fact, I think it's Truman that says the quote that says about the Somosas, one Somoza in particular, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And that's going to be the U.S. thing. Latin American countries, we don't care if they stay democracies. We don't care if they're dictators. We don't care if there's violations of human rights, as long as they're not communist and pro-Soviet. If there is somebody that's pro-Soviet or even hints at being pro-Soviets, we're going to get them out of power. And that's going to be the case with Guatemala. Talked about Guatemala a little bit before. You had United Fruit had come in here, had basically put in place dictators and had built the infrastructure of Guatemala, owned the railroads, owned the post offices, and had bought up tons of land in displaced peasants in Guatemala that had no title to land. And the government, because it was in the pocket of these U.S. businesses, had overlooked these things. So Guatemala had been controlled by pro-Western politicians and had ignored the needs of their people. Banana Republic, we talked about that before, controlled by essentially the banana companies. Well, in 1951, Guatemala is going to get a president that is actually interested in the well-being of the Guatemalan people. He's a guy named Jacobo Arbenz. So Arbenz is basically, he wants to get elected. He's going to run in semi-fair elections in 1951. He's going to run on social reform. Basically, he's going to say we need to do something to help the Guatemalan people. We can't just keep feeding to pro-Western powers. U.S. is actually distracted with other things. And Arbenz, because he's appealing to the lower classes, which are the majority of Guatemalans, he will get elected. Well, he gets in power, and he starts to do things that are going to upset U.S. business interests. He starts to appropriate land from these U.S. companies like United Fruit and redistribute it to peasants. Again, he pays them for the land, but he's not giving the value that these companies want. And again, they're going to be protesting. We bought this land fair and square. And he's going to start nationalizing a number of industries in Guatemala, again, to better distribute their products to the people of Guatemala and the workers. Again, buys up land, starts appropriating land from the wealthy and these foreign companies, giving it to landless peasants, and starts nationalizing industries. Now, he's not going to be doing Arbenz isn't going to be doing anything directly communist, like he's not going to be guaranteeing equality of classes or anything, but he is starting government ownership of industries, which is socialist and sort of pushing on communist. And so this is going to worry the United States. So these Guatemalan businesses, or these U.S. business interests in Guatemala, will ask the U.S. to investigate Arbenz to determine if he is working with the Soviets, if he got any Soviet ties. Well, the CIA, which got informed a couple years before, starts investigating Arbenz, and they're going to determine he is doing socialist stuff. He is nationalizing industries. He is redistributing lands to peasants, but he has no ties to the Soviet Union. He's just doing this because he thinks it's the good of his people. But what the United States is going to determine is, even though he doesn't have ties to the Soviets, we don't want a socialist to be successful, because if it's successful, socialism and perhaps communism could spread to other Latin American countries. So what the United States will do, in spite of the fact Arbenz has no ties to the Soviet Union, is it's going to start putting economic pressure on Guatemala by introducing embargoes. So you can't buy goods from Guatemala, and countries cannot ship goods to Guatemala. Well, what Arbenz is going to do, he's going to look around and he's going to see the U.S. history in Latin America. Basically, U.S., if it doesn't like somebody, will support a coup, overthrow them. So Arbenz sees how the U.S. is acting by putting economic pressure on them, and he suspects a coup is going to be coming next. So he wants to arm himself in preparation to defend himself against a coup. So he tries to buy weapons from Western nations, but the U.S. won't let Western nations sell him weapons because, again, there's this embargo because we don't want to be successful. So what Arbenz is going to do is he will try to buy guns from Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is now under pro-Soviet government, communist government, but this is the only country you can buy weapons from. If he doesn't have weapons, he might get overthrown in a coup. So Arbenz orders these weapons from Czechoslovakia. The United States learns that Arbenz has bought these weapons from Czechoslovakia, and it's going to decide that this is proof that he has ties to the Soviets, and it's going to start forming a coup to overthrow him. So let me just repeat that. U.S. found no ties to the Soviet Union, Arbenz, but had put economic pressure on Arbenz because they didn't want to be successful. Arbenz thought this meant that they were about to get a coup, so he tried to buy weapons from Western powers. They wouldn't let him, so he went to the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, bought weapons from them. Because of the ties that Czechoslovakia has to the Soviet Union, U.S. saw this as confirmation of a Soviet tie, and they are then going to form a coup, which will overthrow Arbenz. And in 1954, this coup will successfully overthrow Arbenz. He's going to be exiled from Guatemala, and basically it'll be a military coup that overthrows him, and a military dictator will take over for Arbenz. Once that guy gets in power, he's going to make sure there's no hint of socialism. He's going to retake the land from peasants, give it back to U.S. business interests, and make sure that the Guatemala stays on the far right and far away from this communism. So if you hint any hint of socialism, communism, U.S. is going to overthrow you. This is going to be the case not just here in Guatemala. Any of these Latin American countries, same thing. I had the opportunity to go to Chile a couple years ago, and when I went to a museum, I saw these glasses, and I was wondering, what were these glasses? Well, these glasses used to belong to this guy's name is Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende took over Chile, and Chile's economy wasn't doing great. What Allende did was he decided we're going to start instituting socialist measures in Chile, and started nationalizing certain industries. So what the United States did was it basically started feeding money to the Chilean military. The Chilean military didn't like Allende, too left-leaning for them, so they're going to launch a coup against him. This is a picture of the Chilean palace where Allende was holed up, and what happens is the military invades the palace, and as the military is breaking in, Allende supposedly commits suicide and shoots himself in the glasses, through the eye, in the brain. But what really happened is the military probably went in there, killed Allende, and then installed a military dictatorship. So the glasses I was seeing was where the bullet went through the Chilean president's glasses. Not the United States doing this directly, but funding the, again, far right leading people, because they didn't like this left leaning guy, because they thought if he keeps going, he could become pro-Soviet, and this is another country outside of our sphere of influence. So again, any hint of communism in Latin America will be met with this swift arming of opposition and making sure somebody on the right is going to take power, and then the U.S. will ignore any abuses from somebody on the far right. So Cold War, again, think of it in these terms internationally. Prevent the Soviets from getting influence, and do what you can to maintain your influence and expand it.